Werewolf Paid Me Back, a collection of true stories of werewolf gratitude. Story number 1. Candy-Loving Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, if you start getting stories of werewolves with tooth decay or diabetic dogmen in Maryland, that might turn out to be my fault. I'm only half joking since I have now had 2 encounters with what your channel seems to mostly call a dogman, and both encounters involved sweets. The first time I ran into this creature, and it was the same one both times, was when I had just turned 14. I remember because I was walking in the woods behind our home in late summer, and I felt sad because later that day my mother was bringing me shopping for new school clothes for the fall. I had just gotten school clothes for my birthday, and I was about to get some more, lucky me. I was feeling sorry for myself that I didn't have a birthday time to get more fun presents, and I was eating one of those big giant chocolate bars they sell at the supermarket. I still eat those when I feel sad, but I eat them faster now. In those days I took little ladylike bites as my mother had always lectured me to do, and I savored those giant bars more slowly. So as I was walking along in my own little world, out of the bushes, a huge dog stuck his head up. He looked at me like he'd never seen a girl before, and it made me laugh. Then it twisted its head to look at me laughing, and I realized it had not been staring at me at all. It was staring at my chocolate bar. I knew that chocolate was bad for cats, but our golden retriever loved chocolate-covered cherries. I was wondering if I should offer this dog some chocolate when it suddenly stood up, a lot higher than it had been standing, and I got so surprised. I dropped the chocolate bar onto the dirt, and I backed up a few steps away from the creature. This dog head somehow, inexplicably, rose higher and higher up into the air, until I could see that it was on the wide shoulders of a wolfman-type creature. Only Lon Chaney was never so muscle-bound. This was the fittest and tallest werewolf of all time. I never saw a movie with a creature like this in it, but this was a movie star that I was looking at. It was a monster, don't get me wrong, but it was all man, and my pubescent self went aflutter. If only I could meet a human like this beast man. That would be the man of my dreams. That was what my 14-year-old brain decided. Meanwhile, I simultaneously knew that this was an animal, and it was probably about to tear me apart and eat me. It was my fantasy life and reality colliding in one bizarre moment. The werewolf or dogman took a giant step toward me. As I hid behind a tree and peeked out, it bent down and picked up my candy bar, which looked tiny in its big dark clawed hand. It had a thumb, or something close enough to a thumb, and it had a broad chest like King Kong or something. I thought it was going to take the candy bar and eat it, but instead, he offered it to me, pushing it up to within an inch or two of the end of my nose. I backed timidly further up into the bush and shook my head, indicating that he could keep that candy bar. Then I turned and ran in one movement, and the creature stayed back where it was, apparently enjoying the chocolatey goodness. When I got home, I told my mother excitedly about what had just happened, but she just thought I was making up wild stories to get out of clothes shopping for school. The more I insisted that it was true, the more she spoke to me like I was a baby. I remembered how she had humored me about my imaginary friend when I was young, and this was like that. She assumed the dogman was my new imaginary friend. At the age of 14? It was embarrassing. So I stopped talking about the monster. At that age, you don't want to do things that make people think that you might be a baby. And so I kept my dogman experience mostly to myself until I moved to the Midwest, years later for college. There I found that cute guys would gather around me and listen to anything I said, once they found out I had 2 different experiences with the dogman. Or possibly this was the Dueo, which is the Maryland version of the dogman. Anyway, I haven't seen the dogman so far here in the Midwest, which is where you're supposed to meet him. Now, this second encounter was literally years later. At this point I was 18 and coming home after attending an illegal rave in Baltimore. My friends had all driven to Denny's in Hanover after the show, and we were feasting on sugar of all kinds. Caffeine, too. By the time they were ready to drive the rest of their ways home, I decided to walk the rest of my way, since my parents' home was just about a 45-minute walk from there, and the sun was just beginning to light the sky. I had been wanting to try a shortcut through the woods that a neighbor told me about, which she claimed would cut the walk down to 20 or 25 minutes, and now I was sugar-charged enough to want to give it a try. I bought another chocolate milkshake for the road, and I left to try that shortcut through those woods I had never stepped foot inside before. If any hunters were about, at least I was dressed in bright yellow clothing from the rave. I still had my boots on from the party. I had not brought walking shoes with me. Those heels aren't so tall that it really would have been a problem if I had stuck to the path, but in the woods, I found myself stumbling in the dim lighting and tripping over rocks and whatever else was down there in the darkness. When I finally came upon a path, I just took it, hoping it led in a good direction. It was a dirt path, not paved, but at least it was beaten down. When I saw someone approaching me off in the distance, at first I felt a bit of relief. Better to be back around people than tripping over tree roots in a dark place where nobody would ever find me, right? Well, maybe. As the figure approached, I could see that it was a man, which did not immediately make me uneasy. When he pulled up his hood and seemed to pull some kind of mask down on his face, though, then I wished I could turn off this pathway. He was much larger than me. Of course, I'm only 5'2" in my bare feet and I guess 5'4" in those boots. This guy was over 6 foot, and he had comfortable shoes on, so there was no chance I could outrun him if I needed to. I decided to just keep walking as though everything were okay, and then maybe everything really would be okay. I could see him checking me out, and I could hear him saying things, but they were in some slang that I was not familiar with. I told him, hey, take a picture, it lasts longer. He told me he had a better idea than taking a picture. He was going to take my milkshake, he was going to take my money, and then he was going to take me. I had imagined something like this happening to me for years, and I had always imagined I'd scream or I'd run or I'd fight or something. But now that it was actually happening, I found that I just sort of went into slow motion and started moving more slowly than before. My emotions were not exactly panicked. It was more like they were dulled. I felt things were about to get a whole lot more painful in just about every single way for me, and I think I just went numb in preparation for what I assumed was the inevitable. But just like in a superhero movie, I saw something moving in the bushes behind this creepy mugger man. The bushes parted, and in my head, I heard a symphony orchestra playing the Dogman's theme once again. There he was, the big muscular fur-covered monster man with the canine head. He was like a superhero, he really was. As he parted the bushes, a ray of light shone down through the trees onto him, like he was being painted by Michelangelo, or something magnificent like that. The dogman growled one time so ferociously that it was almost a roar, and it was loud enough to hurt my ears. The mugger turned to look at the dogman, and began screaming high-pitched, like a lady. This freaked me out, and I think I leaped 2 feet into the air. I dropped the milkshake on the ground and bolted away from the scene. I could hear the mugger screaming behind me, but I never stopped to look back there and see what was going on. I didn't want to know. And really, I still don't. I got home soon enough, but I was an emotional wreck. My mother saw me coming in with a tear-stained face, and she assumed I was drunk or on something. I told her she just wouldn't understand, and she mocked me for being a dramatic teenager. I said, okay, Mom, I'll tell you the truth. I just got confronted by a mugger, then he got attacked by a werewolf. How would you have handled that differently from me, Mom? Tell me. Well, things took a dark turn after that, with me being grounded and having to go see shrinks and so forth, but I just said whatever they wanted me to say until I could get out of Maryland and into a college somewhere far away, and I'm much happier here. I think I would like to try to build a career for myself in Wisconsin after school, if that turns out to be at all possible. I hope it's okay if I conclude by leaving a personal note to the Wolfman who I ran into those 2 times. Dear Dogman, if you are listening to this, thank you for saving my life, and I hope you like the milkshake. Story number 2. A Hunter's Story of Werewolf Gratitude. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was a hunter for 20 years until a leg injury took the fun out of it for me personally. I can still walk, but it's uncomfortable for me to sit up in a deer stand for hours, especially in less than optimal weather. There are other ways I could hunt, but that was the way I just enjoyed doing it, and I accept that those times are over for me. But I did it long enough to have some wild experiences out there in the craziness that is nature. I've got one story that I think your viewers might find interesting for you to adapt and create your AI animations of. It's a story of how I spared the life of a werewolf and how he later returned the favor. It's a story that proves that at least this one werewolf was able to feel gratitude, and he had a sense of personal honor in the way he lived his life as well. I was in my old deer stand, which I was quite proud of. It was the second one I had made for myself, and it was very good. I know this because my first one was terrible. I learned what not to do with that one. This was just before sunset, and I was surprised to see a very large old buck deer with 16-point antlers walking right up to me like it was a video game or something. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It felt like this giant old deer just decided it was a good day to move on to the next realm of existence. It felt like this giant old deer just decided it was a good day to move on to the next realm of existence. And he wanted his head mounted on the wall in the rec room we're building in our basement. It all just seemed too good to be true, and that's because it was. As I lined up my shot, suddenly something large and remarkably fast burst onto the scene, and had that deer on its side and out of my range of fire before I could pull the trigger. In my scope, I zoomed in and focused on the dust in the air over there, waiting for something else to come into focus inside that dust. I wanted to know what in that forest was big enough to push over a deer that size. In a few seconds, I had my answer. And what's more, I had the culprit lined up in my sights, with my target square in the middle of its Wile E. Coyote chest. Because what I was seeing in my scope was not any ordinary kind of animal. I was seeing something big, hairy, larger than a man but man-shaped, with tall Wile E. Coyote ears and glowing evil demon eyes. The dust settling back down all around him looked like fire and brimstone in the dim lighting. And this animal that stood up like a man looked like nobody else but the devil to my eyes on that day. Rather than pounce on the prey he had just felled, seemed to sniff the air and sense my presence. He turned and looked up into my stand directly at me. I almost dropped my rifle, it surprised me that much. I wasn't making any noise other than my heartbeat, but that was enough for the dogman to find exactly where I was in that forest. This was extremely unnerving to me, and I found my body acting like we were going to be leaving this mortal coil. I won't get into details, but if you ever thought you were about to have your story ended violently, then maybe you remember how your body reacted. The body stops caring what the mind tells it in circumstances like that. At any rate, my mind overruled my body, and I aimed my rifle at the werewolf-looking dogman down there on the ground. All I had to do was pull the trigger, and I could have both the deer and the world's first officially recognized real werewolf or dogman body as well. This was my lucky day. Only as I was about to squeeze the trigger and waltz my way into fame and fortune, I made the mistake of looking into that dogman's eyes. His pleading, begging, Sweet doggy eyes. And I couldn't pull the trigger. I couldn't fire the shot. I lowered the rifle, turned around, and I left that dogman to his kill. He was too human for me to shoot him. Not human like they say a Sasquatch is, but human anyway. Or maybe he just reminded me too much of dogs I've known and loved. In any case, I let him take my deer from me, and I also walked away with a bit of a sense of confusion about the place of humanity in this world. Were we the top of the food chain or not? If Dogman is real, why don't we officially acknowledge its existence? Is it the same as other animals? And if not, why not and how not? So I figured that was my one day to see the Dogman. I had dreams about it for years, and I'm no hippie, but I have to say that the dreams were always ones of wonder. Like in the dreams, he was not just any other predator. If the Dogman was in my dream, it would sort of make me take notice. And he always looked at me as though he had something he wanted me to know, if that makes any sense at all. A couple or 3 years later, I was out of my stand in the woods on ground level, trailing after a buck, and trying to get an angle on him where I could take him down more compassionately. That was when I experienced the kind of tackle I hadn't felt since my high school football days. I was body slammed sideways into a tree, and I had all the wind knocked out of me. As I slid down to the ground wheezing and trying to get some oxygen back in my lungs, I looked up to see which member of the NFL had just done this to me. Well, I didn't see a millionaire athlete looking back at me, but what I did see took me by surprise. It was the Dogman. I mean, it was the same Dogman, the one whose life I had spared. And now he had me down, and I was at his mercy. But the look on that creature's face was not one of anger, and not one of hunger. It was one of surprise. It was clear that the Dogman recognized me, but I don't think he had before he tackled me. And instead of finishing me off as he easily could have, I watched as the large predator simply walked away from the scene. I regained my breath. I lined my shot up again, and that buck was mine. Just as I had walked away from the previous deer, so too had the Dogman walked away from this one. I left the first one to him, and he left the second one to me. It goes to show that even animals know the difference between being fair and being greedy. Even animals know the difference between right and wrong. So the next time someone tries to tell you about moral relativism or tries to convince you to do something that you know isn't right to do, remember my story. There is such a thing as real good and real evil. There is such a thing as a difference between right and wrong. A universal absolute kind of a difference. And even the Dogman knows that this is true. If you're above, below, or in betweeno, you'll never find anyone as cool as Big Tino. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Big Tino, for making this episode possible. Tino gifted us with a nice $10 donation using the thanks button that's under each of our videos on YouTube. Tino is also a channel member, so you get to see our secret uncensored Dogman episodes. Here to explain it all to you is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank? Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.